think it meant special.
Special, maybe.
It's a special unclosed closing of whenever Christina's ready. Hi, Joe.
Oh, I know. It is in our meeting calendar, Sabina.
You
Yes.
are live, Mayor.
Okay, let's call to order the city council meeting for February 8th, the special meeting of 5:30. Before the roll call, the city attorney has an announcement.
Good evening, everyone. Assembly Bill 361 suspends provisions of the Brown Act to allow public meetings like this one to be held by teleconference in order to help prevent spread of COVID-19. I'll ask the mayor to recognize me after the roll call to confirm certain matters for the record.
Thank you. Conduct the roll call, please.
Councilmember Armstrong,
Here.
Councilmember Perkins,
Here.
Councilmember Zafar,
Here,
Vice Mayor Veros,
Here,
and Mayor Hudson.
Here, recognize the city attorney.
Thank you. And based on the responses to the roll call, please let the record reflect all council members can hear the proceedings clearly. And if there are no objections, the record will also reflect that each council member believes, based on facial or voice recognition or otherwise, that persons representing themselves tonight as council members are in fact council members. And I see no objections, so I'll turn the meeting back over to you, Mr. Mayor, and remind you that all votes must be taken by roll call.
Okay, thank you. This is going to be a huge agenda item. We'll move to new business, and that's campaign contribution limits. And once again, we will hear from our city attorney for the introduction.
Thank you again, Mr. Mayor, and good evening again. California's Assembly Bill 571 went into effect in January of 2021, and it established campaign limitations for city and county candidates in jurisdictions that have not enacted campaign contribution limits. As San Ramon is one of those jurisdictions, we have three options to consider. Option one would be to do nothing and to let the state limitations apply. The default limit for contributions to the city and county subject to AB 571 would be set at $4,900 per contribution per election. This is adjusted every other year for inflation. The option of this particular, or the advantage of this particular option is you take the burden of the campaign limit enforcement off the city and put it into the hands of the FPPC. Candidates will be required to follow FPPC rules for reporting their campaign contributions, and there'll be some record keeping to be done by the city clerk. Option two would be for the city to adopt an ordinance establishing a different campaign limit. This new and different campaign limit can be higher or lower than the state's number, but the downside is that the state, the FPPC, no longer enforces these limits. That would put the city in charge of enforcement, meaning that the city's ordinance would have to include such matters, and the council would have to decide on such matters as reporting requirements, enforcement, and penalties, and amounts of fines for non-compliance. It would also put staff in the position of having to police the campaigns of each candidate for council or mayor, which puts them in somewhat of an awkward position and creates quite a bit of coordination work for staff, and especially the city clerk's office. Option three then would be to adopt a local ordinance saying that there are no campaign contribution limits at all. This would be essentially status quo for the city of San Ramon, as we currently have no such limits. But candidates would still need to file disclosure forms, still need to follow campaign transparency laws, all of which will still apply. Just FYI, the town of Danville adopted such an ordinance about a week ago. And this option does have the benefit of requiring the least amount of paperwork for candidates and city clerk, but then the council would have to decide, whether the city should go forward without any kind of limitation on campaign contribution amounts. There are other provisions of AB 571 that will apply to city campaigns, but these are going to apply no matter which option that you choose tonight. So the focus tonight hopefully will be on which of the three options the council wishes to pursue. So I'm asking tonight for direction on which of the three options you would like to choose. And based on the direction received from council tonight, we'll either bring back an ordinance for council adoption, or we'll do nothing and let the city proceed with the election under state limitations and with FPPC oversight. And with that, I'll take any questions you may have. And Christine is also available if you have procedural questions about campaign limits.
Questions of staff. We'll start with each, and Sabina's got her hand up. You're first.
So clarification on the 4,900, is it per person? Is it a couple? Like, how does 4,900 mean? What, one person can donate 4,900?
Yes, it is. Yes, it's per
Okay.
person.
Okay, I'm going to ask each one of you before we go to public comment. If not, we'll open it up. Mark, do you have any questions, or Scott?
Well, Martin got to one of my questions a little bit, and that was when we look at these three options, either, status quo, which kind of means really we're under a state limitation, or whether we establish a city limit, or whether we establish no limit. There's different administrative burdens that are kind of referenced in here, and I'm not exactly sure what those administrative burdens are for these different options. I mean, you mentioned a little bit about a disclosure form and the least amount of paperwork and things like that, but again, I haven't had the benefit of actually going through this election process, so I'm not exactly sure which of these options is more advantageous for, I don't want to see an additional burden put on the city clerk, for example. Candidates can handle it, but the city clerk or additional consulting firm or contracting some contractor to have to manage the additional paperwork or something like that, that's going to take away from the potential services that that might go elsewhere to serve our community. So any more on what these administrative burdens are that we're talking about here?
Okay, I am not entirely familiar with all of the paperwork that needs to be done, as I'm not a campaign attorney, but I will say that my understanding of this is that under option one, there is paperwork that needs to be completed. It doesn't appear to be terribly burdensome, but it is additional. It is more than what we would have under option three. Option two, on the other hand, I look at as being, from my perspective, a significant amount of additional paperwork and work and decisions to be made by the city, given the fact that we would have to essentially build a campaign finance law from scratch.
Okay, well, let me clarify also on the different options. I mean, if you set a limit of no limit, it sounds like you are effectively taking away the FPPC isn't going to do it, but the city doesn't need to do it either because there's no limit. There's really no administration there.
That's correct. The only thing that would really apply would be then the transparency laws. So everyone, all of the campaign contributions would have to be disclosed. And, under that theory, the voters decide for themselves whether campaign amounts that are contributed are inappropriate, and they vote accordingly, theoretically.
Okay, so maybe a last question. So when I look at our municipal code, Title A, Division A3 talks about elections, and there's a pledge in there regarding campaign spending. It doesn't address campaign contributions. Could we not do some type of an amendment to the municipal code to amend that campaign pledge for our candidates to address the voluntary campaign contribution limits?
Yes, you can establish voluntary contribution limits. That would be essentially, under the eyes of AB 571, that would be the same thing as choosing option 1, which is doing nothing and letting state limitations apply. So even if you have voluntary limits, the 4,900 per contribution limit still applies, as does FPPC oversight.
Okay, but maybe there's an alternative solution to that. Sorry to run through this, but maybe it's establish no limits. So we're no longer subject to AB 571. And yet establish in our municipal code a voluntary contribution limit pledge for our candidates at a much lower level than the $4,900 limitation.
Okay, yeah, and that would be that would be a creative hybrid that I think would get us around the AB 571. And the only question there would be, how do you put teeth into voluntary limits? And
Well,
which is the same question
you
that we now have.
You don't, but it's subject to public scrutiny.
Exactly. Which is kind of the whole purpose behind the transparency laws as well.
Okay, thank you for that.
Okay, let's go to Sridhar and then back to Sabina.
Yeah, just to make sure we are clear, this is not only individual, but 4,900 is including corporates or any groups or any packs, right? 4,900 is a max.
Is a maximum, yes.
Yeah.
Although I would have to look into what the pack limitations might be, as they are
Different.
They are different. Yes.
They're different. Okay.
Mhm.
And to add point to the council member Armstrong's point about self or volunteer declaration, I think at this point, at least last my elections, the newspapers, they pretty much dig into our campaign finances and they publish reports on how much contributions are done and all that. So just for your information, that that information is public, and there are public who do scrutinize details, and also newspapers do that and they publish that information. And that happened at least last 2 elections from my experience. Yeah. And also, if I remember right, when you take a volunteer oath, it's still, you don't need to stick to it, right? That's what if I remember.
Let's try and focus on questions right now. We'll get to the discussion. Trust me, we're not going to end this thing in 20 or 30 minutes, but any.
No, I just want to make sure if someone, like, I want to understand if, let's say if we put like a volunteer, right? So, but when we put a volunteer, still the scope is that person can always go above the volunteer pledge that person did. I think every year we do, not every year, in the sense, every campaign we do that, right? Volunteer campaign.
There is not a criminal sanction for failing to live up to the voluntary pledge.
Okay. Thank you.
Sabina.
So just adding on to that question, if we decide to go with one of the limitations, one of the 2 options, then will we kind of sunset that ordinance, or will continue to have that in place as well?
Well, the plan would be to have that ordinance be in place in perpetuity. And if, for example, there's a campaign limitation that's put into place, either adopting the state or otherwise, we could build an escalator clause into it.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions before I open public comment? Seeing none, public comment is open. Now's the time for any of our 5 attendees to address the council on this question of campaign contribution limits. Is there anyone who wishes to speak to it? Going once, going twice. We'll close the attendee portion. We do have one written. Did we have another one, Christina?
No,
That's
we
from-
only received
Okay.
one.
Basically, is Robert Klinger. I hope you received it. The contribution limit he thinks should be maxed out at $100. Okay, seeing no further public comment, we will close the public comment. And now it will be before the council for discussion. Let me try and repeat what you're being asked, because you get to number 1, number 2, number 3, and it all gets confusing. The number 1 was take no action, default to state limits. Or you can bring an ordinance to future city council meeting providing for contribution limits different than the state limits. Or you can bring an ordinance to the next city council meeting providing for no contribution limits. And we don't need a motion, but we do need a meeting of the minds and to be clear. And since I didn't ask any questions, go ahead, Sabina, go ahead.
No, why did you wrap up and then I just want to.
Okay, I was going to wrap up with that and just bring a comment into this. I've been in a few campaigns. It isn't really a question of how much you receive, though we aren't kidding anybody, money does make a difference. But there is always that, well, I'll give you, I think it was 2004, I ran for supervisor and the question was asked about a PAC. So 10 PACs got together and made separate contributions and $50,000 went out for a mailer for the candidate against me. The reason that you win or lose is really still going to be on issues and being able to get the word out. The difference between a district election and a mayor election would be completely two different things too, yet ran it as if it's the same, and I don't want to separate the two as we try and build a hybrid. The $4,900, I was laughing until this year, and I go, who in the heck gets $4,900? But that's a different story. I still think we're balancing what we've always balanced, the people's ability to do what they want. And if somebody wants to contribute $4,900 and you're going to tell them, or $4,901, and you're going to tell them they can't do it, where's the reasoning? It still comes down to how much you spend and the message you're going to send out. I really don't want to go after more paperwork because I have also been in an election where there was an FPPC violation sent out, and I have no idea where that goes if we're setting our own limits and they're out of it. FPPC is so slow. I mean, they might be 4 or 5 months behind. So it's the enforcement issue that drives me to the first one. And I'll be voting for take no action and default to the state limits. There is a built-in CPI. Is that the right one? PCI, CPI index that goes up. And I just think it's the cleanest, simplest way to do it. And I don't want to try and reinvent the wheel. Sabina.
Yeah, so I also have very strong opinions about contribution limits. I certainly agree with them. I think there need to be some guardrails around how much is being spent by a single person on a campaign. And I would say I tend to agree with the state. 4,900 is a good one where it's not crazy and it's, doesn't put the burden back on our city, but it also puts guardrails around contribution limits. So yeah, I am also agreeing with you, Mayor, on going with the state limits.
Everybody agrees with the mayor. Scott,
Well,
make a liar out of me.
I really don't want to create a massive city burden. I would really like to see the limit lower. I think that limit is way too high at $4,900. We saw it in this last election. Mayor, you were you were in a race that saw tens of thousands of dollars. But you know what? You hit it on the head when you said the issues became the real element. And so in both your race and my race had contributions that exceeded the $4,900. But for reasons that we may never fully understand, that didn't make the day. And so I don't want to create a new city limit that on contributions. And I don't like the idea of no limits. I campaigned on creating a limit, and like I said, I wish it was lower, but I think the default to state makes the most sense because we give it all those rules that, that means you're going to have to send your 460 forms are going to have to go to the FPPC in addition to, being on the city website and all that. And we'll leave it up to the FPPC people to pass out the fines that go with that. If you have contributions that are either hidden and all the other problems that they have the investigatory staff to go track these things down. I don't know if they have subpoena. I suspect they do have some level of subpoena power so that they can go look at your
I'll
bank
show you the
records.
letter.
Yeah, if they want to go see, they say you have to have a unique checking account for that campaign. And so that they see all the money going in and they see all the money coming out. And so they can see if you're remodeling your house in Hawaii, for instance. Oh, excuse me. Or taking vacations. But I think the best way to go, honestly, is default to the state, let FPPC. I wish the limit was lower for cities than 4,900, but it is what it is. And I would agree with you, Mr. Mayor. How about that?
Elizabeth, I'm coming. Before I call on Sridhar, I want to clarify something you said. We still send the 460s to the city clerk, correct?
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
okay.
I understand the city clerk will get the 460s, but so will the FPPC. Somehow they'll be in that system somehow.
Yeah, if somebody wants a violation, they'll send it to
Virtual now.
them. Yeah, Sridhar.
So, campaign finance reform is definitely a big deal for me. I think it is very important so that we can bring more community-based candidates into the election rather than like last election, we have seen where some folks were trying to influence big time, like
They're
few
community
folks.
based.
Yeah, so in order to avoid that kind of influence, we definitely need to have. And I agree with Councilmember Perkins that we wish we could have our own limits, but then the challenge is how we enforce it, chasing that's going to become nightmare for us. So in keeping that in our overall thought process, in my thought process, so I think we're going with the state limit of 4,900, where FPPC take care of it. We don't have to worry about it. So that's a good option, I think. And also this helps more of community-based candidates able to come out and run for the elections, I think. So that's the reason I would like to go with option 1 with 4,900 state limit.
Thank you. And that just because the option 1 is nobody has this in front of them. That's take no action, default to state limits. Mark, I'm going to come to you last on this thing because I want to remind people no motion is needed, but council may elect to adopt one. With or without a motion, council direction to staff should be clear. And so far, what I'm hearing, and tell me if I'm wrong, city attorney or city clerk or city manager, 4 people are telling you we go with state limit. Mark, are you number 5 or where'd you go? Oh, I'm sorry, you guys hop around on these squares. How do you feel about it? And maybe it's partly the questions, but I can tell you the first thing that hit me is you don't want to start another bureaucracy and do this. You find out afterwards when you do this why you didn't want to do it, if that makes sense. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I clearly don't think we should go in the direction of establishing our own limits, mandatory limits. So I'll take that one off the table. The only reason I even threw out the no limit one was because I thought there might be a workaround in that it would give us less administrative burden and then the ability to kind of work for, towards a voluntary limit in another manner. So, but I'm okay with the state limit at 4,900. I'll just say, I still think in terms of implementation though, that it's not just an ordinance to that effect. I still think we want to take a look at having some type of a resolution that for this current campaign cycle that we're entering now that does address voluntary campaign spending limits, or put that into the municipal code somehow in that election division that's in there to address a voluntary pledge. I think we're all saying that, okay, we'll go with 4,900 because it makes it easier on us, but I think we're all saying it's too much. So why don't we look at, is there a way to then self-enforce that limitation? And then we're accountable. It's open to the public to see whether or not we've followed those voluntary contribution limits and voluntary spending limits that we established for ourselves. That's kind of all I'm saying.
Okay, well, when we do this, we have to be clear if we're going to do a motion, and I'm semi-hearing. And so we're going to go around again, that we take the option, which is take no action, default to the state limits. I still think that leaves it open when we get down to the voluntary. Gosh, and look at this contribution, that if everybody wants to sign it. I'm under the impression that if we take the 4,900 right now, though, we are accepting it, and we're not going to go to look at it as we get closer to the election, or can we still take a look at it? Because every time we do an election, the council is the one that has to approve it. Am I not wrong? I mean, what is the $1.25 per elected voter and all this? See, to me, that's what drove it more than everything else, Mark. It costs so darn much now to do mailers and stuff. It's much higher, and it's certainly much higher if you're running for mayor than it is for a district. Sabina.
Yeah, I don't know if with these limits, if we should keep that ordinance in place. My thing is, it's again voluntary, right? And even if you sign it, you can go above the limit. So
Yeah.
it's a recommendation. It's a great recommendation. And I remember spending exactly what our limits were for some reason. It's just magical, but I think I don't know if we need one more process in place, and Christina to, have one more thing to track if we go with the limits. So limits almost enforce people, to adhere to it. That's,
Yeah.
I guess that's my thing. Like, do we need something which we're saying here that it's one voluntary, and even if you sign it, you can still go above. It's more about the perception.
Yeah.
If you will.
Yeah. And I will tell you, I thought it was 5,000 as I read the 410. So, 4,900 is right where it is, and I never get it. So what the heck? Scott, till now.
When we have, we don't want to confuse contribution limits
Yes.
with spending limits. This AB 571 is all
571.
about contribution limits.
Correct.
And we can still have our voluntary spending limits
Mhm.
when we go forward. One of my campaign issues was we didn't have any teeth in that. And we didn't have any mechanism for deciding. And poor Christina, I asked her in May or June, I said, so when do we start counting spending? Is it January 1? Is it when you file? Is it 1 July? When do we start counting money associated with the spending limit? We didn't have any. It was ambiguous. There was nothing in the ordinance. It didn't say. It said you're limited to, I don't know, 25,000. It was based upon, a dollar amount per resident, and that's fine.
Registered voter.
And that's not a bad way to decide what the spending limit is, but without a start date, and there's a real flaw in the 460s in that the last 460 that you submit is late October and is, visible to the public on October the, 20 something or other. And if you spend money between there and the election, it doesn't show up until the January 31st 460 submission. So any spending after the that last 460 date doesn't show up until well after the election and well after the swearing in ceremony. So that was part of my frustration with the spending limit is we don't have a mechanism to make a spending limit work. There's too many holes in the system to account for that. We can't, after the fact, saying, oh, you broke the voluntary spending limit, so you're no longer a council member. That's not going to work. Or you
Yeah.
spent too much, so we're going to fine you $1,000. How's that going to work? So I'm really, you know, that whole frustration of the spending limit is really problematic. And if with a $4,900 contribution limit, there really is no limit on how much you can spend if you're collecting a whole bunch of $1,000 checks and things. I mean, they're going to be disclosed. And one of my real irritations was my opponent said that I took money from special interest, and she didn't. But if you look at her contributions, she was getting money from unions and other organizations. And if unions aren't special interests in the political sense, I don't know what is a
It's
special
got a
interest.
radio on.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm sorry, I cut you off, Scott.
No, but my point is that, yeah, this is a contribution limit and I'm good with that. And I'm still frustrated. And if anybody has a access to any spending limit legislation that's actually meaningful and works, I'd really like to see it.
Let me throw two things in and then we'll see if anybody's against going the clear direction to staff. One, I told you the story and I didn't make it clear. The 5,000 was the maximum contribution that you could give in the supervisor race. It could be the same here. We're talking about a few years ago. And 10 unions got together, 10 PACs, whatever, and they sent it out as an independent expenditure. So I don't think it was even part of what you would call the total revenue or whatever we're spending. So there are other ways. Also, Sabina asked the pertinent question. 4,900 from one person, 4,900 from another person in the family, and you've got a race. You could actually run for any of these districts. That's enough to do it. May not be enough to win, but that's enough to do it. And the one thing that we've forgotten, 497s are a more important part of this than we're letting on right here. Every $1,000, you're notified that somebody contributed or spent, well, not spent, but you're notified that this is going out. So, I mean, if you want to take a look at something where there was a huge expenditure, I mean, to me, it isn't something I'd spend a lot of time on, but the 497 to me is as enlightening as you want to get on these contribution limits. It tells you where the money's coming from and it gives you a heads up immediately within 24 hours. Am I wrong, Christina, or 48? Within 24, 48 hours, you have to send it in from when you got it.
But that is only 90 days, right? So if I remember, 497 form is only for 90 days. Before to that, you don't have to.
Well,
Correct.
yeah, but you're going to turn a 460 in June. I mean, it's like, okay, you're notified, and I'm not so sure it is 90 anymore, but that's okay. I just do them anyway. If somebody's going to give me that much money, but if that's something you want to take a look at outside of 571, and it's not part of what was in that other verbiage the attorney was talking about, you know, when we get to the campaign limits, let's get to it, because I think that's kind of what you were touching on also, Scott. You don't know what's going on in January, February, March, whatever. Other than it is, well, cumulative on the 460. I don't bother that much with it, so it isn't a big thing to me. But I got to tell you, from time immemorial, ever after, people have been trying to reform these elections, and the more you change them, the more they stay the same. People are interested in what interests them, and they want to be part of what the solution is. And that comes through in campaign contributions. I mean, you don't like it, but unfortunately, it's going to keep coming. And that's just the way it is. It's never worked in my favor before, but it didn't matter. You spend what you got and you do what you can. Unless somebody's got a genius idea to make it work, I'd say we stay with the state limits so that we don't have to do FPPC's job. What's the feeling from the rest of you?
I agree.
We got 4 thumbs up, Mark.
Yeah, I'm okay with the FPPC limits. That's that's not my issue. I think, and I don't know that we have to decide it today.
We don't.
I think there ought to be some discussion on what do we do about the voluntary limits for both spending and contributions.
Okay, well, if I can make a suggestion right now, because we don't need a motion, I've seen nodded heads from the staff. But Christina, if you don't mind, sometime, maybe not this week, but next week, I want to pull out what that sheet is, if we have one, of what campaign contributions are. They may even be online. The thing that we don't go after family, what do you call it? Code of ethics and stuff like, I'll pull them all out. And, Joe, if you got a moment, we'll sit down and say, okay, is this something that policy can take a look at it? Probably should bless it I don't know about every other year. We should be looking at it anyway, because every time this legislation changes something, it changes something. And we don't pay that much attention to it. But as far as campaign limits, I think this is as good as anything I've seen so far. I mean, unfortunately, guess what, folks? 5,000's been on the 410s to fill out for as long as I can remember, and I just laughed at it. Now it's not laughable. That's the kind of contribution, as we get to be a bigger city, that's normal. They spent $100,000 in Concord. I mean, it's crazy what goes into city council meetings, elections. Okay, is that clear enough direction, Martin?
Yes, thank you, Christina.
Yes.
I see her nodding her head as well, so.
Okay, we don't need a motion. Anything else for the good of the order before I adjourn? You guys go eat before we come back at 7? Okay, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you for all your help, and we will see you back at 7 o'clock for the regular